I'm just going to introduce myself really quickly, and then I'm going to introduce our three panelists. Unfortunately, Tucson Water is not here because, as Jana already mentioned, they're doing their rate hike public hearing tonight. So I did see Candace today on a webinar explaining why it makes sense to charge more for meter rates, which I don't understand, but you know, anyway. They backed out at the last minute, and unfortunately we couldn't fill that. But I think we have three really great panelists here, and they're going to have some slightly different perspectives, and I think you're going to learn a lot. So please listen to what they say, and then think of your questions, and we will have ample time at the end for questions. So anyway, I'm Dan Stormont. I'm your Master of Ceremonies for tonight. I work at Watershed Management Group. I'm also on the core team of Sustainable Tucson. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just introduce themselves quickly. Well, I'll introduce who they are, and then I'll let them talk about themselves and their organizations and what their viewpoint on water is. Then we're going to jump into a short presentation by Trace about some of the background at the state level, and then I'm going to talk over the handouts I gave you on Tucson Water, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll jump right into the questions for the panelists. So I'm just going to go ahead and do it in alphabetical order. So Sal, you're up from Tucson Water Protectors.
Hey everybody, my name is Sal. This is my son, Lecriani. He's 2. It's crazy. Wow. A little ball of energy. So I work with Tucson Water Protectors. We're a grassroots, standing in solidarity with all like progressive resistance movements, like all over the place, especially within the Western Hemisphere, specifically indigenous resistance, and we kind of made a name for ourselves, I suppose, in terms of like direct action, working within the confines of like systemic stuff. Like what I'm hearing a lot of is also new to me, so it's interesting to learn that too. Anyway, we're a local Tucson group. We've been around for a little bit. We do a lot of good work, have a lot of very capable people, and would love to see other people like interact, react, however things kind of manifest into like whatever's new.
Continuing to go in alphabetical order, I guess. Trace, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is Trace English. I'm with Sustainable Tucson. My direct involvement in water goes back to around 1960, I believe, when I did an hour documentary on water in Tucson for DCCC. Mostly my activities in water relate to water harvesting, aquaponics, things of that nature. But I go to most of the various water resources meetings, water conferences, and other things of that nature. So I do try to keep up to date on water issues.
And last but not least, Trevor Hare.
I work for Watershed Management Group along with Dan. We spent the last 30 years here in Tucson working on wildlands, riparian restoration, erosion control, upland restoration, helping the Forest Service, BLM, and ranchers to be better stewards of the land. I joined Watershed Management Group with an urban focus 5 years ago, and we're working towards a vision, we have a vision working towards a restoration of flows in our desert rivers. As many of you probably know, these rivers all flowed in Tucson, so that is my main focus, but I'm involved across the board with WMG's other efforts, water harvesting, green infrastructure, policy, so I hope to be able to share that with you tonight.
All right, and there is a little bit of information on the back table there about Watershed Management Group if you aren't familiar, so there's some stuff, feel free to take it. And Trace, you're up.
Okay. Jerry informed me that it wasn't 1960, it was 1980.
Only see, I thought there was a baptism in 1960.
Even I'm not quite that old. Any rate, so the first question, I'm going to give a brief background, mostly on what the Central Arizona Project and some of its implications for us. The first question is, why do we even care about the Central Arizona Project? And the answer is pretty simple. It provides us with almost all of our water. You see the green area on that graph. That's the percentage of water that comes from the Central Arizona Project, which is basically a canal that brings water from the Colorado River about 336 miles away and a half mile beneath our feet. It's a long way, and it's a lot of water, and so it's actually our primary water supply.
In the Colorado River, starting at the upper basin, we move the water out of the basin. In Wyoming, we move it to Cheyenne. In Colorado, we go across the Continental Divide to the Front Range cities. Cross over to Utah. Central Utah Project takes the water all the way to the Wasatch Front. Come down to New Mexico. It moves it out of the Colorado River watershed to the Rio, to Albuquerque. Las Vegas uses it. 300 plus miles of Central Arizona Project Aqueduct goes to the central cities from Phoenix all the way down to Tucson. On the other side, it goes all the way to the coastal cities of Southern California. Because Metropolitan Water District of Southern California takes half its water from the Colorado River and half of its water from the Sacramento Bay Delta, they're connected. What happens in the Bay Delta matters in Cheyenne. It is one huge plumbing system that is intricately connected. When you start looking at the system in those terms, it changes your perspective.
CAP is, as I said, it's our primary water supply, but it's only a small part of the water that's distributed from the Colorado River. In fact, the Colorado River doesn't even cross the U.S.-Mexico border in its own canal, in its own channel, most times of the year, because it's been taken up by all of the different things that Pat Melroy was talking about there. We originally got the CAP after decades of political work by the Arizona delegation. In fact, it took 22 years from the end of World War II to 1968 to get Congress to actually pass the $1 billion appropriation to fund the construction of the CAP canal. But it came at a price. And that price was that Arizona, specifically the CAP canal, has the lowest priority of all the water users on the Colorado River. As a result, if there are any shortfalls, the CAP is supposed to eat them first. The whole system is divided into the upper basin and the lower basin states. And the lower basin states are California, Arizona, and a little bit of Nevada. And what the rules boil down to is that California gets 4.4 million acre-feet out of 7.5 million acre-feet, even if Arizona or the CAP only gets as little as 0. The problem we have is that when they made these allocations of how much water each state got, there wasn't actually as much water as they gave away. There's a difference, it turns out, of currently about 1.2 million acre-feet a year out of 7.5 million. That is what they euphemistically call paper water. There are two kinds of water in this part of the country. There's paper water and wet water. You can get an idea of what wet water is. Paper water is the right to receive water, whether there's any water there or not. The graph on the right there is the key measure for water for all of the water users in the lower basin states. It's the elevation of water in Lake Mead. Lake Mead is where all of the water that gets distributed to California, Arizona, and Nevada comes from. And if the level of Lake Mead drops to certain specific predefined points, then they have to start decreasing the amount of water that everybody gets. And that red line is the first of those breakpoints. So you can see that we're basically there. And in fact, in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been real panic because nobody wants to say, we don't have enough water to provide everybody with what they want.
Trace, where is 2017 on that chart?
And what's the red line number?
20, I can't read it. 2017 is right around here. So this is where we were at just a few years ago when we started to really say, we got to do something. And at that point, around 2014, it was around 2014, Tom McCann of the executive director of CAP presented to the CAP board a presentation that says, we got problems, folks. And I think they got into that because they were using a 10-year running average, meaning they were looking at whatever was the average of the last 10 years. So they didn't realize that the water supply was just falling over a cliff.
Is that an elevation line, that red line?
That's 1075. That's the first of the breakpoints. It goes 1075, 1050, and 1025. And at each of those points, there's a different amount of water that gets subtracted from the system. They're called the tiers. Tier 1 is 1075, and at that point, Arizona loses 320,000 acre feet out of 1.5 million. Tier 2 is 25 feet lower than that. We lose another 400,000. And Tier 3 is almost the lowest that the water can go and still take water out of it. And at that point, we lose another almost 500,000 acre feet a year. The amount of water we're talking is immense. CAP is a canal and piping network that's 336 miles long. It's half a mile lower than our current elevation. And I calculated it out, that much water weighs about 250 million tons. So now, this is actually even more complicated than you're going to see, because in the last 2 years, they've introduced something they call the DroughtContingency Plan. And I think I explained it in here, but this is the way it was up to 2 years ago. When they really started to recognize how much trouble they were in, some of these things have been around for years, others have been created recently. So for example, in Tucson, we receive 144,000 acre feet of water a year, Tucson water. We haven't been using it all, so they created the Central Avra Valley Water Conservation District and the Southern Avra Valley Water Conservation District, or Water Storage and Recharge Project, to recharge that water. And what we do now is we used to pump water out of hundreds of wells scattered throughout Tucson. Now it's pumped out of Avra Valley, over the Tucson mountains, and then down into Tucson. So our water actually almost all comes from Avra Valley, ultimately from recharge from the CAP. But it's not just what we're doing here. One of these little things here is the groundwater savings facilities. That's it's an accounting system where if you don't use the water you had a right to, you being an irrigation district, you get paid to not use that water, and that is counted as savings of water. And therefore, that's part of the storage that is built up for times of shortage, as opposed to
Paper storage, right?
What?
Paper storage.
Well, I mean, there is water there. It's just water that wasn't used. So, yes. There's also the underground storage facility, which is where we actually store water, and that would be CAVSARP and SAVSARP as two examples. There's several dozen of these water storage facilities around the planet. Some of them are around the state. Some of them are actual storage facilities. Some of them are not storage facilities. They're not usage facilities. They're just all over the place. So there's long-term storage credits. If one of the things that's happening now is that Phoenix is pumping water up to Tucson. It's being stored in Avra Valley, and then in a time of shortage, they will take the water that would have been pumped up to Tucson, and instead we'll pump their water out of our ground, and they'll take the water as it goes past Phoenix. So all these different things represent ways of either storing real water, trading water, saying that you didn't and take credit for it. One of the key things is the Drought Contingency Plan, which changes some of those numbers so that the rest of the state and California and Mexico are all prepared to take some portion of shortfalls. And that's in place for another 5 years, I believe. This is the way it's changed. The total size of that graph is the 1.5 million acre feet, and then as you see each of the levels, the 1075, 1050, 1025, those represent the elevations of Lake Mead, and those numbers are the amount of water that would be subtracted from Arizona's or CAP's share once Lake Mead gets down to that. It has its own losses, and now Mexico has its own losses, so those are in addition to the red arrows that I have shown there. But there's one thing that's important to know is that there are priority users. So that top thing, the orange there, was excess water. So that was being stored in the ground to meet future needs. The gray is sort of Anglo agriculture. It's a lower priority. The higher up on this thing you go, the lower the priority is. So as you go down, the priority increases, and those two big colored bars at the bottom, the left is Indian priority pool, the right is municipal and industrial priority pool. Those two have co-equal rights to water. So as water is subtracted from the system, different users have less and less water. And when you get to tier 3, there's actually some loss to cities and to the Indians. The question's going to happen that we're going to face is what's going to be happening in the future, because on the left is what they think would have happened if the future was the same as the past. So they have 112 years worth of runoff data for the Colorado River, and projecting that forward, they were predicting a pattern of availability or lack thereof based on the historic climate that we've had. The problem is that we think, pretty sure, that the climate is changing. And as that happens, water that we would have had in the past isn't there anymore. And you see the one on the right is only the effect of what would happen if the future was like the last 28 years as opposed to the last 112. And you can see that as you go further and further into the future, there's less and less water in storage on average because we're getting longer and longer droughts, and there's greater and greater evaporation. And so as time goes on, they're predicting that there's probably going to be less and less water available. That million acre feet shortage by the 2050 or thereafter really represents a big cut in the amount of water that's available. So we're not sure what's going to happen, but the predictions that they're making now are that it's probably going to be a lot harder in the future than it has up till now. So Tucson Water says we're going to find more water. These are some of the things that they're considering as sources of new water. The second largest one in the 50-year long-range plan for the city is weather modification. They think that by 2060 we're going to get 1.7, we could get as much as 1.7 million acre-feet a year of new rain because we've modified the weather and it rains more. Desalinization is the biggest potential source. About $2,000 an acre foot. We're currently paying something on the order of $200 an acre foot for water.
That's an easy one for California.
There's magic ways to do this. You can desalinate water near the ocean and trade it for somebody who would have traded to Mexico, who would have gotten it there, and then you take the water that would have gone to Mexico and you pump that up instead. And so they're playing all sorts of strange games like that. Another possibility is importing water from the Mississippi River, icebergs and the Columbia River, other possibilities. Municipal and industrial conservation. We have been conserving more and more water in this community for decades. They're planning on us doing more. They even mention rainfall as a possibility. And it's not cheap. That's probably not a totally unrealistic number there. I think it might be a little less, but that's one of the smaller options that they were considering.
No, rainfall harvesting, is that like just getting like cisterns or?
Well, actually,
ponds,
I should refer to that. You can do active water harvesting, that's called. There's also passive water harvesting, which is one of the things that Watershed Management Group is working on. Turns out if you don't do the passive water harvesting, you lose as much as, I won't say a half of your total water, but a major fraction of the total rain that falls, because a major fraction of the water we receive is in small rainfalls. So you get a 1/4 inch or an 1/8 of an inch or something like that. It's not, you can't really do much with that, but if it falls directly on a plant or runs a few feet off to the side of the road into what's called green infrastructure, which is where you can grow trees and all sorts of things of that nature, then you can actually get a major increase, perhaps as much as about 1/3, simply by capturing the small rainfalls first. But in addition to that, there's a whole other technology called dry wells. They are wells that you put water into as opposed to take water out of. We've got a few dozen in Pima County. There's something like 70,000 of them in Phoenix. And in the Southwest, there's roughly 250,000 of them. So it's a technology that's actually fairly well established, but for peculiarities of our politics, we never did it. But that kind of water harvesting provides us with the opportunity of capturing literally tens of billions of gallons of rainfall and recharging it into the ground. It's not something that stays above ground and you use it individually. It's something that becomes part of our common water supply. So it's a big deal here. This is what the Bureau of Reclamation is predicting for Tucson. They're saying, we're not going to have any, you guys aren't going to have any problems till 2060. The reason for that is because they're predicting a continued decrease in the amount of water available to each one of us. That's been the policy of Tucson Water since the mid-70s, about 1977, when the water recall election occurred that kicked out the city council for actually daring to charge people what it would cost to provide them with water. And since then, we've been promoting conservation as a means of making sure that there were no barriers to a growing population. So the Bureau of Reclamation is saying that we won't have any problems because we're going to get our CAP share, and we're going to get more water, and because each of us is going to have less. So, will we have water shortages in Tucson? Well, I don't think we really know the future, but what happens if climate change happens? That's a possibility. What happens if we don't want to have a giant fossil fuel plant pumping 250 million tons of water uphill every year? What if our priorities change? Because right now we only grow about 1 to 3% of the food that we eat here in Tucson, and mostly in people's backyard gardens. If we decide that the loss of food worldwide because of violent climate or increasing temperatures or loss of groundwater supplies for irrigated agriculture, and we need to grow food, which I believe is the characteristic or the need for all 21st centuries is to produce a lot of their own resources locally. If our priorities change, are we going to have water shortages in Tucson? We could. Do we want to pay 10 times as much for the water supply as we currently are?
No.
The water price you pay won't be 10 times as great, but the water that is part of that cost could well be 10 times greater than what we're paying now. When CAP was built, it was built with a 50-year federal bond and either 0% for stuff that was for farms and 2% interest rates for municipalities. Maybe we're not going to get any federal subsidies and we're going to have to pay for it ourselves. So that could influence whether or not there are shortages in Tucson. And finally, politics happen. All of the negotiated settlements or the negotiated conditions that we're planning on require that California and Arizona and Nevada and the farmers and the cities and Mexico and all of the different water users all agree, and they haven't yet. So there are a lot of reasons why. We'll see. But that's kind of the context that we're facing as we look at what is the issue, or what do we mean by a sustainable water supply for Tucson. So that's basically what I got.
Users there are in the city of Tucson, so these numbers aren't including areas like Oro Valley or Marana. You notice here's the map of the service area. Not all of that service area is actually getting service. Some of it's obligated service area where they promise to provide water, but nobody is actually getting water because they haven't hooked pipes up to them and they haven't demanded it. So that's the area there. I also had the contract for Tucson's allocation from the Central Arizona project. One thing you might find kind of interesting on there is that we've actually given up some of our water to other water utilities in the area. And of course, as Trace already mentioned, we're storing some of Phoenix's water for them. We also are storing some of our water allocation in Lake Mead. So we're just not taking it, we're leaving it there. So Tucson Water has actually been doing that. Another really interesting thing, I love this map, so I wish it was bigger, I'm sorry, but I had to fit it on the one page. So on the back side, you'll see the groundwater level change map for the last 16 years. And this does kind of highlight some of the things that have happened as we've both conserved water and as Tucson Water has been storing water out in Avra Valley. So Trace mentioned the Avra Valley, the SAV SURF and the CAV SURF, the Central Avra Valley Storage and Recovery Facility and the Southern Avra Valley Storage and Recovery Facility. That's where they recharge the water from CAP. So basically, the CAP line terminates at those two facilities. You've probably seen it. If you've gone out to the Desert Museum, you see those big settling ponds out in the distance. That's them. That's what they're there for. So they put the water in there, let it infiltrate into the aquifer in the Avra Valley. So you can see This purplish color here means that there's been a really huge change in the level of the groundwater. It's come up quite a bit, nearly 100 feet there, just because they've been storing that water. And then what they do, as Trace mentioned, they pump it back out of that aquifer, run it through the treatment plant, and then bring it over the hill to Tucson, and it goes into the distribution system, mostly. There are some others that are kind of interesting. Does anyone know, just for S's and G's, does anyone know what this little green circle right at the intersection of I-10 and I-19 is?
Sure. Mines. And the car company.
Actually, that'd be the ones probably a little bit farther south. There is that area down there where they're recharging effluent, which is they put a lot of store in these. I did give you at least the sources of where I got them from, but there really does need to be sort of a literature survey done that collects all the various studies. There are studies that study every little piece of our water issues, but I've seen very few that look at the holistic thing other than the city-county plan, which Trace was referring to, the 50-year plan, which hasn't been updated in 6 years now, so they're like way past time to probably update that. But if you look at the municipal area of so just the Tucson city boundary, this is not the total municipal area or the total metro area, but just the city of Tucson itself, that's about 145,000 acres, and the average annual rainfall, according to the National Weather Service, is a foot a year. Now, if you've been paying attention, you know we haven't had a foot a year in several years now, but in theory, if you look at the long-term average, it's been a foot a year, which means that we actually get just as much water as we get from CAP falling on the city of Tucson every year. So yeah, we do get enough rainfall to meet all of our needs. The problem, of course, is how do you take advantage of that rain that's falling on there? And that's one of the things that Trace alluded to as well. So, you know, if you had a 2,000 square foot house, you could harvest 14,000 gallons per year of water off of your roof. So that would be something that you can use to feed your plants, feed your trees, and not have to use that municipal water. If all of the Tucson water customers harvested the water off their roof, it would replace about 9,900 acre feet of cap water, which I'll have to admit was a lot smaller than I expected, but you got to consider that's just what's coming off of the roof, and it's just what's coming off of smaller homes. So it's not, you have a big roof like commercial properties or an apartment building, they get so much more water off their roof if you're taking advantage of it, and unfortunately we usually aren't. The other thing, just down here, we are, and this is something I don't think Trace mentioned, you didn't mention the active management area. So throughout Arizona, there are active management areas, which means that anything that you do as far as water issues within there has to be approved. You know, you have the 100-year requirement for sustainable water, which we'll get to in a minute, because I'm sure that Trace will have something to say about that, and everybody else will have something to say about that. But an interesting thing to me is that you get about 2.5 million acre feet of rainfall in the whole AMA. Again, it's 12 inches of rain on average. Yet we're only getting about 33,000 acre feet of water that are exiting the management area up at the Trico-Marana Bridge. And the reason for that is a lot of that actually is infiltrating into our riverbeds and the stream shed as they go along, and it's helping to feed the riparian environment and those things. So a lot of it is actually getting recharged or taken up by plants along the way. So I found that really interesting, and there's some references there. So something thought-provoking, maybe it'll bring up some questions, but that's the reason I wanted to hand those two things out. So now, without further ado, you're tired of hearing me talk, and Trace, you're going to get cut short on your answers.
You think.
I've never seen him get cut.
The first question I've got for our panel is, what does sustainable water, if we want to have a sustainable water supply in Tucson, what would that look like to you? And I'm going to start with Sal over on the far end, because Trace got a chance to already talk about that.
Well, I guess my answer is a little more complicated than like A plus B plus C, which I acknowledge that, and I'm glad that there's the plan. There's a lot of the plan. I can see it all over this stuff. Honestly, for me, that would be to have enough water to sustain the ecosystem here as it should be. So it kind of stands outside of this whole idea of like whether it's economic development or like industrial use or residential use. It's that we are able to have the capacity for our environment to sustain itself and us fit into that. So my mom used to tell me about Tucson back in the day. She's from here. We didn't move here until 1995. But apparently there was water in the Santa Cruz River even into the 60s, you know, and I think about that. Like an actual river here in Tucson. You know, it seems almost like a dream, or like I don't know, like something that couldn't even be real if you look now. You know, I hear about that there used to be cottonwoods all up and down the river. But you're actually a very like sacred plant in terms of like desert people. We use a lot of cottonwoods, which would make sense if that was a sign of like a vibrant riparian habitat, because that would also be a sign of like food and resources and things like that. So I don't know, you know, it's sort of hard because on one hand you have like the city of Tucson. They just recently they went forward with a plan to provide free water. Hold on a second. Free water and like free water hookups to businesses in the I-10 corridor and on the edges of Tucson. So to literally create like what do they call that? The expansion of the city outward. Urban sprawl. To literally like promote urban sprawl, and it passed. You know, and this idea that they can like their little chessboard, that they can move this piece and this and this and this. And I understand that, right? So when I was younger, I used to work at the U of A and the Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering Department. And we actually got to work with this wire, this electrified. It wasn't even wire. It's more like a fabric, but a fabric you could electrify. And DuPont was trying to figure out what to do with it. And so the idea was desalinization, right? To attract, you know, the ionic compounds to it, et cetera, et cetera. Because yeah, everyone's kind of thinking that way. What do we do in the future? I don't think that there is. I think that it's wonderful and great to actually come up with the literal things in the sense of like, what do we do then with this piece and this piece, and if the water runs dry here, and to see that presentation was actually really interesting. It's just, to me, it makes me sad. Honestly, it makes me sad that it's like you have this giant, literally like this whole riparian habitat of the whole western United States being funneled into like giant urban like cesspools. And it's not just here. You go to Hermosillo. Hermosillo is the same thing. They're extracting all the water out of the surrounding countryside and pumping it into Hermosillo. And this idea of like this future city thing. We do not have cities figured out. Human beings do not have development figured out. I feel like it's so far beyond that. We even almost need like a ban on development for a while until we start figuring these things out. I think it's worse, actually. Now, looking at all that stuff, I think it's actually much worse. The long-term future, to not think of water as this commodity and this thing that can be bought and sold, but like as this life-giving, beautiful thing that you like pay respect to. You know, and yeah, okay, the whole indigenous person thing, you know, but like that water is like that beautiful connection to the earth, literally like that cold, caressing, like it's a gift, you know. So, I mean, my idea for sustainable Tucson, a sustainable riparian habitat, a sustainable water system in general in Tucson, is for you all to go call your friends and to call their friends and their friends and their friends and demand and literally come into these places of power, whether it be TEP, Tucson Water, CAP, all over the place, right? All these industrial places. Because I also access those places like in like a professional sense. We interact, and you never know, you know, serendipity and all that, where you're going to have the capacity, but we have to we need to create like an action plan. And I'm not talking about them. I'm not talking about, you know, in much respect to like the hydrologists that have figured all this stuff out and like the planners, but like coming from that perspective of profit and and development and like the, what is that group that's always, they're always at everything and they're always on the other side of everything that I know.
Saba. Southern
They're one of them.
Home Builders Association.
No, but there's another one. There's this girl, and she's like real nice to you, but then come out with some crazy stuff.
Tucson Chamber or something like that.
The
Chamber of
Tucson
Commerce.
Metro Commerce thing,
Oh,
yeah. I think it's very scary. And not that I'm like anti, I think that we do need to learn how to develop, honestly. Like, I think development is like this whole undiscovered country, honestly. I think that we have no idea. Really, if you think about it in terms of society, like we're just baby steps beginning to like even confront the idea of what does sustainability mean, et cetera, et cetera. But I will say that the original peoples of these lands, the Hohokam and the Atam later, were masterful rainwater harvesters and masterful. They were able to take the naturally occurring water and use it to like create sustainable societies here for thousands of years. And I understand that we're talking about a larger scale now, like more people, I get it, right? But we also have access to like the historical knowledge up until this point, which is a lot. We have access to like, from like traditional knowledge to like scientific knowledge to, I don't really see an excuse. And I guess it's kind of nice to come into this place because activism kind of wears you down and honestly I was kind of stepping back and kind of like looking, like trying to see the forest for the trees kind of, you know. Sometimes I get stuck in the forest, but I can't see the tops. I'm trying to kind of get lost in it. But I think that but I would also ask you all to be careful and like having your, like on one hand, focus is great. Focus allows you to get things done. And where that is your focus is the environment. But what I will say, and like from the bottom of my heart, is that like, people are natural too. People are the environment too. So like so separating like the environment and people and social issues and the environment and like they exist somewhere else and this and that. Please don't do that. I gave a speech at the Science March, last year's Science March, and honestly I was particularly unimpressed. There was this idea coming from the group that they wanted to like to make the March for Science apolitical, and I was just sort of blown away. The idea that like there's this like, I mean, the reality is whether you like it or not, whether you believe me or not, or where you stand in your political perspective, there is a correct side to history. I won't say right, because that plays another whole paradigm of all that right and left stuff. But there is a correct, sustainable, fruitful, beautiful side of history, and like deciding where people stand. And like honestly, the truth is, the money and power always stand on the other side. There's just no way around it. They always do. It's always an uphill battle. Like you're not gonna have like the philanthropist would decide one day, hey, I'm gonna buy this whole, you know, somehow we're gonna make privatization work. So I would also like to go beyond this and like create an actual system, like to go back in time to where we have actual municipal water supplies that aren't privatized and aren't being used as like checkerboard, chessboard, playthings essentially, where people are trading in this stuff and making money off of this trade and that trade, and just, you know, things that are sacred in the way that I was taught. Again, very fundamentally, things that are sacred are not bought and sold. So it's real hard for me, and I understand that we live in a society, and like here I am, and there's no going back, there's no putting things back in a bottle, but it's like there's like a deeper perspective where I'm not sure how to like put that into the larger conversation of, on one hand, where you're comparing the A's and B's and C's and the ones and twos, you know, in the plan and this and that, and how do we, you know, but also in a larger sense, I would ask that you all like think about like the water cycle, right? The water cycle, even as like a personification, not just this abstract thing. Like there's a cycle and it happens. Like think of the earth as literally as an organism, you know. And within that organism, there's a way that air and water and different things move within it. You know, almost like your veins, you know, and your the way that, like, think about it in that way, like in a biological sense. And try to like understand, not even understand, because I think fundamentally we all understand, but actually manifest this like protection of that resource. And not even as a resource, but it's because it's literally our mother, literally that which we form. We form because of the earth and the sun, the interaction of like particular molecules and particular, you know, solar energy rays and et cetera, literally birth life on this planet. And theoretically there should be lots of life. But as far as we know, there's none on Mars, there's none anywhere else that we know of so far. So it's like I told those scientists, unless you're really, truly going to like fight for yourself, ecology, etc., but yourself within that ecological perspective, you're going to have to go to Mars.
Thank you, Sal.
Appreciate that.
All right, so, Trevor, you said everything you're going to say, so.
Yeah, I'm done. So I spent the last 35 years here in Tucson working to protect and restore water for natural areas, for birds and snakes and frogs and fish. And that was good because I really don't like humans that much. And because they are the destroyers. I'm not sitting in a room full of destroyers here, thank God, but they're out there and we know who they are. But some of the things that changed my mind and really showed me that humans are part of this and can live sustainably on the landscape with the Santa Cruz River flowing through their backyard. I mean, it starts with the history of the desert peoples here, pre-Anglo invasion, where they used stormwater to provide for most of their needs. But I've been working down on the Santa Cruz River in Sonora, in Santa Cruz and San Lazaro. One's a small town, one's a bigger town. The Santa Cruz still flows through those two towns. They've been taking water out of the Santa Cruz for over 300 years in those two towns, irrigating their crops, raising cattle, raising kids, building churches, sending their kids off to college in Hermosillo and in Nogales. But the Santa Cruz looks like what the Santa Cruz used to look like in downtown Tucson 200 years ago. So it really opened my eyes that people can live along these desert rivers without destroying them. Myself and Joaquin Murrieta, our cultural ecologist at Watershed Management Group, did Drunk History of the Santa Cruz last week. No, 3 weeks ago.
See if you forgot.
And I was drinking tequila and I got really angry at that idea that greedy Anglos destroyed our river over here. I've got Welsh and Irish in me, definitely an Anglo, but I'm still angry at those people who came in 100 years ago and demanded more than they deserved. And I'm still angry at people here in Tucson for demanding more than they deserve out of our natural resources, out of our beautiful desert, plowing over vegetation to put in really crappy housing developments. Everybody knows this, but our good friend Ed Abbey said that, you know, the growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of a cancer cell, and I still see that in Tucson. But I do see it changing. I see the old guard going away, not necessarily in development, but in regulation, in the hydrologists and the planners and the engineers. That old guard is gone that used to build things where they forced creeks into a straight, channelized concrete ditch. That stuff is changing, and it gives me heart. Our city and county government is changing. I've been involved with the Coalition for Sonora Desert Protection for the last 20 years. And just the Sonora Desert Conservation Plan, that Pima County actually has a view of how to do conservation, a view of what the urban form looks like, and how to protect our wildlands that surround our area and are at the top of our watershed. Some of the ideas I have to make this a more sustainable place in regards to water, and this really surprises me, about 2.5 million acre feet fall in the TAMA, and only 33,800 feet exit at the Marana Bridge. Because I always tell people, what we need to do here is we need to capture water in the upper watershed, in the foothills, in Saguaro National Park, in Nogales. We need to sink these storm flows into the ground, let them slowly flow underground, surfacing where the river wants it to surface, but really extending the hydro periods of these, because I don't want to see those giant floods going into Marana or into Pinal County where they're sucking that groundwater out to water cotton fields. But now this kind of changes that whole argument. So we actually need to dive into this deeper.
We do.
Dan, in the office, because I want to get my facts straight. So that's been one of my arguments. But really what I've been thinking here today is we have encroached upon our natural system of how Mother Nature designed the Tucson Basin to convey water across our landscape and into the Santa Cruz River, which is the ultimate destination for the entire area. And that is to de-concrete all of our washes, move the streets back, get rid of the private property in floodplains, rewild our whole system. I live on Arroyo Chico, or one block off of Arroyo Chico. In my neighborhood, it's a little bit natural with oleanders growing along it. In the Colonia Solana neighborhood, the Rico neighborhood right there by Reed Park, it's got a fairly nice natural area, but it's not natural. It was all designed. The wash is 6 feet deeper than it used to be, only flows during storm flows. Arroyo Chico used to have fish and frogs in it 150 years ago. So I think it's doable, and this idea of really rewilding our wash system, our river system, including the Rito, the Tanque Verde, Sabino, Cienega Creek, CDO wash, Southerland wash, all these washes, rewilding those is to get the next generation of people who will be making decisions on the ground here in Tucson. Our children, my daughters are 25 and 30, will be decision makers in the future, to really accept that we live in nature, not above nature, and start changing those norms and those mores with the people who make those decisions on how large chunks of public money are used, and really make a voice for sustainability in Tucson by making people more connected to the natural rhythm of what the Sonoran Desert has to offer in their own backyards and in their neighborhoods. And I'm not going to live to see that day. Watershed Management Group has a 50-year vision to see a return of flows, as I mentioned before. I think it's doable. I won't be here to see the end of it. But really, by rewilding our water courses, private property rights be damned. They've done nothing but destroy what we have here in the Tucson Basin. We have to do this. The Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan is a very visionary plan that Pima County put forward, but really it was to cover their ass so they can do infrastructure and give developers permits so there's no Endangered Species Act violations. But the larger encapsulating vision of that is a good place to start, and then you add in WMG's 50-year vision of protecting and restoring stream flows. I say screw the CAP. Again, here we have 145,000 acre-feet of rainwater falls on Tucson in a year, and in 2016 they delivered 87,000. So right there we've got a bonus of 50+ thousand acre-feet of water that we could be storing for future use. The CAP canal's an environmental nightmare, fiasco. It's cut off wildlife linkages from all the way from the lake down to Tucson. You didn't mention that they want to take it to Sierra Vista too, to protect the San Pedro River. Just another kind of crazy idea. Instead of Sierra Vista really looking hard at what they're doing to San Pedro, our last free-flowing, non-dammed river in the southwestern United States, they'd rather have the BOR bail them out, spend billions of dollars to get the CAP into the San Pedro River Valley, instead of actually taking a long, hard look at the greedy cement heads that are trying to drive development in that valley. So, I mean, that's my vision. It's about living, and it's that land ethic that Aldo Leopold talked about, whatever that is, 90, 70, 60 years ago. You have to live within what Mother Nature is giving you, The Tohono people give us a perfect example. The Hohokam people give us a perfect example. Let's run with that.
Greedy cement heads, that's the word of the night, I like that one. Okay, Trey, summarize what you already talked about.
Well, I didn't talk about any of this. I was talking about CAP.
Oh, you did talk about some
That's not
sustainability
sustainable.
too.
So the question is, what's it going to take to have a sustainable water supply for Tucson? And I think there are really three fundamental characteristics of a sustainable water supply. One is that it's permanent. There's a real question as to whether or not we have a permanent water supply with the Colorado River. We don't know what's going to happen, but a critical characteristic is that it not be short-term. The Tucson Water says we don't get any CAP water, we've got 50 years of water beneath our feet. Well, you know,
Maybe.
Tucson, we may have more, but Tucson has been a continuously inhabited place for over 4,000 years. So what's our target? 50 years or 4,000? So one of the basic characteristics of a sustainable water supply is that it's going to be here for as long as we need it to be. Another characteristic of a sustainable water supply is that it's reliable. It's great to say, well, we've got water now, but next year we may not have it, and then we'll have it after that, or, you know, we're really facing some serious problems about being assured that the water is actually here when we need it. I look at the CAP and all the demands on the Colorado River and all these things, and I'm looking at something that the longest drought in the tree ring record is over 60 years long. The mega droughts that actually have happened in this place are much longer than anything that we've been willing to plan for. And that's prior to global climate change. So we could be facing extended droughts, decades long. And I think there's a realistic chance that we will have very little water from CAP for many years at a time, and that the average we get from CAP is going to be a lot less than we're currently planning on. So that's the kind of policy decisions that we're scrupulously avoiding at this point. But a reliable water supply is the second characteristic of a sustainable water policy for Tucson. And the third thing that's really critical is that there are limits. That goes to the last question, but there are limits to the amount of water we have, and we have to set priorities for them. And right now, Tucson Water has one basic priority. Actually, they have a whole set of priorities based not on what we use water for, but who gets to use it. And under the current system, the people with the lowest priority for water is us. Since the late 70s, it's been Tucson's Water's policy to charge more for the more you use, regardless of what you use it for. And to actually charge, to do that in order to force conservation on people. Okay, well, we waste, in my view, we waste all of our water, but what we use, the lowest priority is whoever's here. And the reason we do that is to ensure that there's abundant supply to give it away to more people. So the reality is our policies have been for a third of a century and more, force conservation on whoever's here in order to make water available to more people. And that's our basic priority. So we can go into what it should be, but those are the three characteristics that I think must be in a sustainable water supply.
So What would your priorities be, given that we do most likely have limitations on this water supply?
Priorities are what Tucson will have to use our water for if we are going to be a sustainable community. Right now, we use water to flush toilets. We use water to irrigate decorative landscaping. The biggest consumer of our renewable water supply is the water that runs down the street until it evaporates. That is the largest single consumer of water, is just evaporation. As I look at the world, I see an unstable global food supply. With more people than there's food. We've got 8% of the region is trees, and the rest is either ground cover or just bare dirt. And when you start applying runoff coefficients to roofs and roads and plants and bare dirt, you find that there's approximately 65 billion gallons of harvestable rainfall in the metropolitan area, which is a good third more than the total amount of water that we get from the CAP. Furthermore, there is 280, I believe, square miles of land that does not have roofs or roads on it. And so what I did was I said, what is the extreme upper limit on the amount of water and the amount of food that we could produce in Tucson? Because I believe cities around the world are going to have to provide a significant fraction of their own food from within the metropolitan area. So I said, what's our potential? What's the theoretical upper limit so that we'll know what we can realistically back off from? And what I found was that we receive more water than we get from CAP, and B, we have about 3 times as much rainfall per person as a place like New York City. Why? Because they've got 10 times our rainfall, or 3 times our rainfall, but 10 times our population. So we've got 3 times as much rainfall per person as a place like New York City. We've got 10 times as much land, and we've got 20 times as much sun. And if we were to use all of it, it turns out we could produce and use the most efficient techniques available. We could produce 100% of at least the poundage of food that Tucsonans eat every year. Does that mean we should try? No. There's a lot of reasons that we don't want to try to do that. But what it really means is that we have the opportunity to choose how much of the basic resources that we need that we can produce here in Tucson, because we've got tens of millions of square feet of land that could be used for solar collectors. We've got tens of millions of square feet that could be used to produce food. We can turn our neighborhoods into parks, because the green infrastructure that Watershed Management Group keeps pushing on, that will allow us to collect the smallest third of the entire rainfall. And if you don't collect it at that very, very, very small scale, you lose it entirely. The runoff coefficient from a roof or a road that's only where the water is only running 50 feet is close to 80%. 80% of the annual rainfall that falls on a roof or a road and just runs down the street a few hundred feet maybe, we can get close to 80% of that, but only if we put it into your green infrastructure. On the other hand, the big rains, the ½ inch, ¾ inch, 1 inch, those sorts of things, you can't capture those in shallow basins, but you can capture them in a network of what are called dry wells. And that technology turns out to be able to produce water at about what we're currently paying for water, much cheaper than most of the things that are being considered. And by storing in our aquifer tens of billions of gallons of rainfall that we're currently wasting every year, gives us the ability to ride through the dry spells, the times when there isn't water, and that becomes the the basis for the food, the natural beauty that we could recreate in Tucson, because we could turn our city into a permaculture food forest, turn our neighborhoods into parks, and actually make our Tucson a much safer and more beautiful place for us all to live. So you want to know what our priorities are? I think we need to put our priorities on what it is that's going to make Tucson a much more beautiful place, a much more resilient place, a much more sustainable place in terms of water and food and energy and the things that we need for our daily lives.
So my thought is, so people want to move to Tucson. It's a beautiful place. You know, whoever it is, downtown Tucson is doing all kinds of business development, trying to get companies to move to Tucson. We need to think about how we provide ourselves, residents, new people in Tucson, the opportunities to do exactly what Trace is talking about. And that means not building neighborhoods on flattened desert. That means building neighborhoods with green infrastructure and water harvesting and underground cisterns in place. We have to convince, not the powers that be, not our elected officials so much, but the people at SABA, Southern Arizona Home Builders Association, the National Home Builders Association, that providing that type of housing in the long run is good business sense. Because many of the kids who are moving into Tucson would love to have a house that was solar, water harvesting, food forest in the backyard, next to a little wash that has lots of cover and they see lots of birds and an occasional bobcat come by. They can't afford that right now. But that stuff is affordable, and in the long run, I think home builders could make money on this, and I'm not the person to figure out those economics, but I think something like that is one piece of the puzzle here. You know, after I rewild all the washes, and people can come in, and where we had done preeminent domain and kick people out of the floodplain, people can build again right up next to the floodplain, but not in the floodplain. The other piece of that puzzle is kind of the economic development picture here in Tucson, and we're more focused on, let's bring Caterpillar in. It's not just Caterpillar who's making farming implements. It's not Caterpillar that's making farming implements, tractors. It's Caterpillar that's making giant machines that rip copper and gold out of the Santa Rita Mountains. That's not the kind of economic development we need in this basin. We need economic opportunity, not development. My daughter's moving to New York City in July for economic opportunity reasons. I've been trying to get her to leave Tucson since she first went to college, but that's another thing. Go out and explore the world, but until we have actually economic opportunity for everybody who lives in the Tucson Basin, equitable shade on the streets, equitable access to recreation, both natural, hiking, bird watching, and sports and organized activities. And until we can offer those things to everybody in Tucson, a lot of these ideas are just not going to work. One of the things I was going to come in here and say is every time I go to a meeting about this, I was just over at the Cross Watershed Network meeting over in Socorro, New Mexico, along the Rio Grande. And the complaint is we're always white and old in these meetings. So I'm actually glad to see some non-white faces and some young people out there. Yay! There's a couple in there. So I was really happy when I came in and saw that. Because generally it's all guys like me and Trace with white hair on our faces.
White hair.
If not, you'll soon have it. So, Really, it's about engaging youth, and every time I engage youth, even though no matter if it's in the foothills at Catalina Foothills High School, where many of their parents are those greedy cement heads that I referenced earlier, or some of them are, they get what we're talking about, and they hopefully are taking those messages home to their parents. They may go on and become a frat boy and get an MBA, but maybe they remember those lessons that I taught to them at Catalina Foothills, and when they buy a house in Tucson, they buy it with a cistern and next to a natural area, and they pay a premium for that. But maybe that goes to making that bottom, the rate on investment for the builder better, so he will build more homes that have cisterns that do water harvesting and are solar. So, I mean, that is kind of my high-end approach to this. Again, my low-end approach is rip out all the concrete, all the asphalt, permeable roads, wild washes, bobcats in the middle of Tucson, maybe Sonoran grizzlies.
If we do a permaculture food forest, you won't be able to avoid the bobcats in the city.
Right, exactly, exactly. So I think we're all on the same page when it comes to that idea.
And then Sal, if you can wrap up quickly, we're going to get to questions from the audience, but just your thoughts on these.
So I agree and I agree. My part that I would like to throw in there is that I'm a little wary of the commercial aspect of it. I work for a solar company. We install arrays with a friend over there, Dwayne. But and we do a lot of good work. And we're all over the north side, we're all over the east side, we're all over very affluent parts of town, but much less so anywhere else. There's definitely a flow of capital in this town. So what I propose, or where I would go with it, is a mandate, like a social mandate, a mandate through whatever capacity, whether it be like elected representatives or I don't know, I mean, but honestly, like the Corporation Commission and all that, to me, is very, very, like, it's just very shady. I wish that there was a way, and the way, maybe that is the way, is to, like, for people to create, like, a popular council, I don't know, but to, like, create that mandate, that social mandate, to force, on one hand, yes, because it makes sense commercially for these home builders, but I don't want to, honestly, I don't want to reward home builders who would do the exact opposite if they possibly could. Like with this, like, so yeah, like spaces, like I'll just say straight up, green spaces tend to be rich and white, right? Me as a person of like Mexican indigenous descent, I come into green spaces, and now to a certain extent it has kind of evolved and there are other groups in there, but for the most part it's always been rich and white. And all those, the Tucson water rebates that the Tucson Water is giving out for people to like invest in rainwater harvesting, etc. Like 99% of them were like north of Broadway or something. There was like a very
like all in Midtown and in
very
the foothills,
specific
definitely.
like cutoff, and that to me is unacceptable. Like if you are a person that believes that the free market will save us, we stand on totally different sides of the issue. What can I say? Sorry. And what I see is like my things I move toward will include some free market stuff and some like what the people like what wealth wants. But I also could give a crap less what wealth wants, and also we need to create like a citizens alliance for water. You know, honestly, something that has teeth, that has power to it, that can rival like these home builders and the Sabas and all of that. So I guess I would say that we have water at the moment. It is dropped. I used to work for a company. We used to go clean the wells at the U of A, and they pump out of the U of A. They pump out of a lot of places. I was reading this, but I'm not sure whose water our water is, but the U of A doesn't use water. It doesn't use cap water. It uses water from right underneath it. And it's at 120 feet. It used to be at 40 feet. So, you know, it's one of those things, you know, like the water level keeps on dropping and they don't stop using it. You know, these very like you know, everyone loves the U of A and everybody's like, oh yeah, the U of A, and we all have Wildcat pride and this and that, but it is those same institutions that pay us, that employ us, but that are also part of the problem. So like, look deeper, don't, like, and I don't know do I know the answers of like looking deeper and finding out that in fact that it is like these like conglomerates of like power and money all around us that also employ us and like, and where things get super crazy and complicated? Yeah, that is the reality. But it kind of doesn't matter. There's been the water usage like in Marana and feeding those fields out there for all these years did in fact employ the Yaquis that were migrating from Mexico, which is my tribe. Like they employed those Yaquis to work in those fields and allowed them to like build permanent settlements here in the Tucson area. So it's complicated, and I'm not going to say it's not, but like fundamentally, again, what I go back to is fundamentally we have a responsibility to be stewards of this land because we're here, we're gifted this opportunity to be here, and people move here because of culture. They don't move here because of strip malls, they don't move here because of golf. I mean, they say they do, and maybe in Green Valley they do, but there's nobody in those golf courses, I'll tell you. We look down there all the time, there's nobody in those golf courses. It's too darn hot there, right? So people move here because the tacos are good, because the Sinaloa Desert is awesome, and because there's a particular culture and a particular feel to this area. And that is like our most powerful thing that we have. And we need to use that to like push and empower us.